Resuming our discussion of British response to the 1920 rebellion, it's worth recalling that on February 1920, a few months before the full-scale rebellion, Churchill wrote to Sir Hugh Trenchard, the British air warfare pioneer, encouraging him that in addition to bombing, he should consider some kind of asphyxiating bombs which can cause disablement of some kind, but not necessarily death. There is really ample evidence showing that Churchill was very eager to use chemical weapons against the indigenous uprising. In fact, he regarded the use of poison gas by RAF as some kind of the Royal Air Force, as some kind of an experiment finding an effective and far less costly means for dealing with the indigenous revolt than relying on the conventional troops. So as you can see, poison gas should be used against the recalcitrant Arabs as an experiment. These are all quotes from Churchill. As he put it, he was complaining to objection from some of the cabinet members, and he regarded those objections as unreasonable. As he puts it, he says, "I don't understand this squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes to spread lively terror." End of quote. What I'd like to suggest is that from this quote, you now understand the original shock and awe doctrine, which is the more colorful name for the military doctrine of rapid dominance by reliance on overwhelming force. So this is what really Churchill was after. So in justifying the use of poison gas, the Churchill maintained that the use of this gas as being scientific expedient, and it should not be prevented from using it by, quote, the prejudice of those who do not think clearly. In other words, to think clearly is to understand why these are very good and useful instruments, and were gas to be used against Iraqi rebels with excellent moral effect. So I don't need to comment on the hypocrisy here on how they use this. All you have to ask yourself, imagine if these people were Western people rather than Iraqis, would he be saying these things? So you can see a clear racist element. Also, it should be pointed out that Churchill seems to have believed that the use of these gas would not cause death, but would only cause discomfort and illness. This, to me, seems pretty disingenuous, given the fact that World War I, which had ended just a couple of years earlier, had introduced the world to the horrors of mustard gas and the horrible injuries and pain and even death it causes. So, despite the urging of Churchill, at the end, dropping of gas shells was given up because of technical obstacles and that could not be overcome, and not because it was decided that it was morally reprehensible. So they decided not to use gas because technically they didn't have a way of properly delivering it. And as a result, we had RAF instead undertaking a horrific bombing campaign against the tribesmen. So the British bombing campaign really was brutal, and it caused a lot of damage. All in all, our RAF, the Royal Air Force Air Campaign, involved some 4,008 hours, and they dropped close to 97 tons of bombs, fired over 183,000, almost 184,000 rounds. And in terms of the casualty, nearly 9,000 Iraqis were killed. By contrast, you can see this was a pretty effective way of dealing with resistance if you have no sense of morality and ethics. The British casualties were 9 killed, 7 wounded, and a loss of 11 aircraft. Now, after this rampage, the brave British pilots described their conquest against their Iraqi victims in the following way. As you can see, RAF was feeling their oats. Wing Commander Gale of Royal Air Force justified the bombing of the Kurds in the following way. He said, if the Kurds hadn't learned by our example to behave themselves in a civilized way, I suppose civilized means to play dead and allow the British rule over them, then we had to spank their bottoms. Another wing commander, Sir Arthur Harris, who later became renowned as Bomber Harris, head of the Wartime Bomber Command, noted the following: the Arabs and the Kurds now know what real bombing means in casualties and damage. Within 45 minutes, a full-size village can be practically wiped out and a third of its inhabitants killed or injured. The bombing campaign actually ended up vindicating the Royal Air Force as the modern powerful armed force in the arsenal of the British, and it showed them what Air Force can do with them. And I would also like to again remind you that this was the origin of shock and awe doctrine of handling the Iraqis and more generally the Arabs. This was also the doctrine that 83 years later President Bush adopted as American policy when he ordered invasion of Iraq with the initial phase of shock and awe by bombing the facilities in Iraq. Now, the question really is, how did the British see the rebellion? So at some point they got to ask themselves, how did this rebellion got started? The answer to that question reveals a lot about what British thought of the Iraqis. Remember, for the British, the Iraqis are childlike people. Childlike people don't have any public opinion. They can't think for themselves. Therefore, they couldn't have, on their own, resisted British domination. They had to be instigated by others. And the British, therefore, could not believe that they could be subjected to rebellion simply from the indigenous forces. In other words, there is an inability on the part of these imperialists, and we talked about the imperialist worldview, to see the people who they were ruling as belonging to the same species as they were. In other words, they by themselves would not object to being dominated. They would have to be instigated by outside forces. So who did the British blame? Who did the British blame for instigating the natives to rise up against them? The French, because they lost Mosul, and the Bolsheviks, the communists. They could not believe that this could happen as a normal reaction of any human being against domination by outsiders. So going back to Iraq now, the rebellion ends with after this brutal bombing by the British, but in the process, Arnold Wilson loses his job in 1920, and he is replaced by Sir Percy Cox. With Arnold Wilson gone, the British did learn one thing, that the real cause must have been the direct formal rule, which was the most strongest way you can dominate other people. So from this point onward, they would like to switch to indirect formal. Indirect formal, you may recall, means instead of you having colonial officers, you try to use indigenous people that are cooperating with you, so you rule through indigenous local cooperating elite. The typical example throughout the Middle East, remember, the moderate responsible are those who are willing to cooperate with the foreign government. And then formal, in the sense that it's still Iraq is the colony, but what they wanted to do is to change the direct rule to indirect one. And from that point onward, they began to work with the traditional elites. And the formality, though, is still there because Iraq is still the colony. In August 1921, Faisal becomes the king of Iraq, and you may again, as a reminder, recall that Faisal also had been very briefly, for about 136 days, king of Syria just before that, until the French defeated them and forced them to leave, and the British brought them to Iraq. And from the period 1922 until 1932, we got this decade in which British want to strengthen the landowners. They want to strengthen tribal chiefs because their forms of rule is changed from direct to indirect rule. And this is the period in which Faisal is really under a lot of stress because Faisal was really, if you recall, was the liberal member of the Hashemite family. He certainly was not comfortable with the British control over the Iraq and over him. He wanted true independence, and Faisal really tries hard to explain to the British that unless he is given some genuine power, he will be seen as nothing but a puppet king and will have no legitimacy. This is nicely captured in a letter that he wrote to Percy Cox, who succeeded Arnold Wilson. If you notice in the letter, he says to Cox, "His Majesty's government and I are in the same boat, and we must sink or swim together. If you wish me and your policy to succeed, it is folly to damn me permanently in the public eye by making me an obvious puppet." So here he is telling the British, you're not going to get far if my masses see me, if my people see me as the puppet. So in 1932, British tried to make a cosmetic type of concession. So what they did was, in 1932, was to give Iraq symbolic independence. And this is pretty much what they had done in Egypt. And the symbolic independence involved really lowering the flag. That was one thing. And also changing the commissioner's name to that of an ambassador. Other than these two cosmetic changes, everything remained business as usual. So this so-called formal independence was just like the one they gave initially to Egypt. It didn't amount to much. And by 1933, Faisal dies, and his son Ghazi succeeds him. The story is that Faisal died of a broken heart. And so a lot of people who admired Faisal really blame British for failing to honor their initial commitment in McMahon-Hussein correspondence by giving true independence to Iraq. Now, Ghazi's, who succeeded Faisal, his greatest claim to fame was his love of fast cars. And befittingly, he dies in a car accident in 1939. And his infant son, Faisal II, succeeds him. Now, if you're an Iraqi, who do you think they thought had killed Ghazi? The answer was nobody believed that he simply died in a car accident. They believe British killed him because he too wanted genuine independence. So they did create a legend out of Ghazi. Ghazi's son, as I mentioned, is Faisal II, and he is put on the throne at the ripe age of 4. As you can imagine, the real power is now not going to be held by Faisal II, but the real power is held by a regent. And the first important person here is Abdul Ilah, who happens to be the maternal uncle of the infant king, and he is going to serve as a regent. The Iraqi government is therefore going to be run by the regency. And then the second individual is one Nouri al-Said, who serves as the prime minister. In terms of sheer competence, he really was a first-rate individual. He really was the man of the era. He was very smart and very tough. In terms of political philosophy, he was an extreme right-winger. Said was strong-willed and very paternalistic. He viewed his own people very much in an identical way that the British regarded his people. But he did have one big advantage over the British, and that is he could see the situation well, and he could manipulate it and adjust, whereas the British were unable to see the situation well. Now, Nouri al-Said came from an upper-class family in Iraq, but the upper classes also produced another type of leader very different from Nouri al-Said. His name was Rashid Ali Gaylani. Rashid Ali Gaylani was very much like Mossadegh, a liberal Democrat. And so we now have a kind of a showdown between a tough conservative Nouri al-Said versus the Enlightenment liberal Rashid Ali Gaylani.